This is a conversation with Richin Kabra. He's a trader by profession with a bachelor's in economics and statistics from Columbia University in New York and a master of science in computer science from Oxford University. In this conversation, we discuss what is money, heard a lot about it, haven't seen much of it unfortunately, the psychological impact of money and the link between money and power, central banks, inflation, and we also discuss the differences between centralized and decentralized ledgers. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, or rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This project continues to take a lot of my time, money, and effort. It's not getting easier to do, especially in New York, a city that's notoriously difficult to live in. But I'm going to keep doing this project because I really believe in the vision of it. So if you'd like to see this project continue, then do consider making a donation on Patreon. Thank you to the people who continuously do so. You're the ones who are making this show run. For other forms in love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally. And now, it is no time. There's a popular joke in economics, which goes something like this, that economics is the only field in which two people can get a Nobel Prize for saying completely opposite things. For the longest amount of time, economics has been considered this very exclusive subject, very esoteric. So esoteric that renowned academics like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Mick Jagger, who studied economics in college, midway through decided, you know what, maybe a different career. So what I've tried to do with this episode is I've tried to structure it as an experiment. I've erased any prior understanding of money, markets, economics that I have. There wasn't much to erase anyway. I know we're all thinking it. And with your assistance, what I want to do now is I want you to explain all these terms to me as you would explain to a 5-year-old, which is my mental age anyway. And in that process, hopefully we'll be able to build a nice, comprehensible understanding of the financial model and maybe explore some deeper ideas through first principles thinking. So that's the experiment. Are you down to participate?
Let's do it. Let's see where we go, Shalaj.
I'm glad your answer is yes, because it's too late to say no, honestly. I've already set up. So let's dive into the first question. Let's start with the silliest question possible, the most basic one. What is money? And what role do you think money plays in the world today?
Sure. Let's start with a little bit of history on how we can explore such a topic. Let's think about the past where transactions were valid only through a unit of transfer. I could transact with you if you gave me something, and we both needed the other person's good or service provided. So if I were to give you some wheat and I needed some corn in return, we could have done that transaction. However, if I wanted to buy clean water, that wasn't possible because you didn't have clean water to sell to me. So I would have to go to a third person, find someone who needed that wheat packet, get clean water from that in return, and then move that around. And in this scenario, we realized that over time that this wasn't feasible as the increase in the number of goods and services created an extraordinary possibility of combinations that we needed to approach. And hence we realized that this barter system would no longer be possible. When that happened, somewhere during the Yuan dynasty in China in about 10th century, this concept of bills came around, or notes. And at that point in time, the government were the only control of these notes. And that's when the first time what was introduced was something called fiat money. And fiat money is simply saying the authority to transfer a unit of value from one person to another. So it's simply a signed note that says, oh, this note is worth some amount that can be associated to some sort of commodity or some sort of service. This could be, oh, I will be able to buy 1 bag of wheat with it, or I will be able to get some clean water delivered to me. And so money in its most basic form is a 3-part situation. It's a unit of value, like we discussed. So it has some intrinsic value associated with it, and it could be pegged to some sort of good or service. It's a unit of account. Unit of account simply being that it stores a particular transactional value. And then finally, it's a medium of exchange. A medium of exchange being simply that one person can use this fiat money to move from one good to another good, or from one service to another good, or from a service to another service. And the interesting idea about money and how sort of it plays a role in the economy is quite large, but we can dive into each of sort of the different components of it. One being durability. So let's explore what durability would do. Say if I had a bag of wheat and this was this money that we had in the barter system, over time, this wheat would dissolve, become useless, and maybe even be consumed by me. So I would just lose out on this store of value. If we moved on to something else like commodities, maybe as gold or silver, those would become too heavy to carry at some point in time. So the durability of fiat money is quite interesting, and it's a good concept where this piece of paper might stick around much longer than most goods or services or most commodities that you can use as an exchange or a store of value. The other idea is divisibility. A fiat money, you can have smaller denominations of such a fiat money, versus if you have this bushel of wheat, or if you have a bag of wheat, how do I have half a bag of wheat? Then I need more bags. It's just not easy to divide it. If I have a gram of gold, I can't get half a gram of gold unless I go to a mint and actually get it divided. So divisibility was an interesting factor. Acceptability, since the Yuan dynasty, like we talked about in the 10th century, acceptability and approval became the next best concept, where if I went to you, you knew that this was issued by some central authority that paid the same amount of value when I went to the central authority and redeemed that bill. And so acceptability became another big factor. Another factor was a limited supply. So for instance, now, since fiat money is regulated by some sort of central authority, you know that there is a finite amount that is present in the economy. Versus in the past, if it were bushels of wheat, I could have just created some bushels of wheat and then use that sort of agricultural produce as my money. Or if it were gold, I could just go start mining gold, and people would not have sort of this identity that this is the right gold that is sort of accepted, or this is not the right gold. And that creates an issue with sort of this idea of fake money as well, because then you would just dilute the economy with the increase in the wealth or increase in the money supply that you were just producing. And lastly, it is about something that we can define as transactional value. So the transactional value of fiat money and how it affects the world is that you and I understand that this holds value, and you associate it with certain number of concepts, a certain number of goods, a certain number of services. And you can use this because you and I regard it as the same unit. And that's what the acceptability or the accountability point is. So those are sort of the 5 different concepts, and that's how it affects the role in the economy.
Can you comment on the power of the network effect? You've touched upon it when you were talking about the barter system, where objects inherently had some value in them, and then we moved into signed notes that were transfer of value, representative of value in a way. So most of the money today is digital. If you really break those numbers down in online banking, they'll just be bits, it'll just be ones and zeros, which we can argue don't hold much value. And even if you take a $100 bill today, if you actually break it down into its components, it will not, most likely it won't value up to $100 itself. So can you comment on how strong this contract we have signed between us, or this mutual agreement that we have signed, and at any point, if anyone violates this contract that we signed, that, oh, this $100 bill doesn't represent $100, then everything falls apart. Are you surprised at all that this has lasted so long, especially in this world where countries, companies, even 2 people find it very hard to agree on anything?
Sure. So let's divide your question into like 2 pieces. Let's address the network effect first. So for our viewers, a network effect is simply a question of how sustainable or how truthful a system of this representation is. And a network effect is simply the amplification or the multiple that's added to it with the increase in user base. So the more users using it generally equates to a positive network effect, because the sustainable truth or the sustainable source of that effect increases and amplifies. And then is the communications effect, which one person tells another person, and that increases the node where this transfers from like a singular object to like a multiple use case scenario. And so network effects have 2 main features, one of which is called a direct network effect, and the other one being an indirect network effect. A direct network effect is, think of it as like social media. The more people use it, the more people accept it, the more people understand it, and the more people get a benefit out of it. So if I'm on a social media and I want to connect to you, but you're not on it, it sort of breaks the idea of why am I even on social media if the only one thing I want to do is connect with you. Whereas if you're on it as well, we can use this as sort of a medium creation and you can utilize it for a variety of different reasons. The indirect network effect is sort of slightly more tangential, and that is generally when 2 groups or more than 2 groups of users use a particular instance. And the network effect is when one group increases in number, so the second group benefits from that. And you can think of it most recently or most noticeably in rideshare or a marketplace. So the network effect there is when the number of drivers and the number of riders increases, it benefits the other group. The increase in number of riders will help the drivers. Increase in number of drivers will help the number of users. And that's generally the case with content creation as well. I prefer using websites that have more content. And so the more developers they have, the more content they create. The more content they create, the more users they get. And then it sort of feeds back into this circular loop where the more users they have, now they can hire more developers and more content creators. And this sort of is this network round circle effect. Now to your second part of the question, which we touched upon slightly, but is this idea of what happens if the truth or the truth breaks down or some fallacy comes into play and people stop understanding what the reality is. And this has happened in the past as well with the Bretton Woods system. So what happened was the American dollar back in the 1930s was pegged to an ounce of gold. So every ounce of gold was worth 35 US dollars. And over time, people realized that maybe the government has issued more money than the amount of gold it has under it. So if I were to go to the government and give my $35, I wouldn't get an ounce of gold. And this distrust was created in the economy once. And so we can explore this idea through a historic element that we just described. And this happened into the 60s where over time, the US government realized that they've had too many suitors come in, ask for the gold in return, and take away so that the government can take their money away. And eventually, the US government realized very shortly after that they did not have the right amount of gold to back the instrument of money that they just created. Hence, the system was about to fall apart. There are a few notions of what happened after, but the most commonly understood theory was the Bretton Woods system was abolished and the US dollar then became a self-standing source of money. Now it has its pros and cons. The pros are, now you're not backed by any physical object because most physical objects in the world are finite. They are either some sort of resource that has to be mined, or they are some sort of concept which is in some sense created by another human, or is some sort of natural element. The natural element we described, the human element is again, in a sense, also restricted because you need human power and human competition to create these elements. And so the US dollar moving away from this backing of physical commodities was helpful in that sense. But then it comes back to the question is, what if I stop accepting the US dollar? Which is when, and we can dive a little bit more into this as well, is when the centralization of authority comes into play. So if you and I believe in a court system, why do we not believe in another central authority that guarantees that this fiat money is going to be accepted, that we talked about earlier, and that everyone will believe in this sort of fictitious concept? And then coming back to the network effect, if they can guarantee one person to believe it, they can expand that idea from one person to a second person. Now you have two people telling two other people about it. And this sort of pyramid scheme just grows larger and larger, but it is built upon a central authority.
A lot of things to unpack there, Richin. But this might sound slightly paradoxical. I apologize for jumping around, but do you think it's possible to have a universal, decentralized form of payments that doesn't rely on the network effect?
That's a good question. And that's sort of the research that's being conducted in the present world as well, where how does this decentralization of money come to play when there is no network effect? If there is not enough user base, then how would you have this like worldwide concept? And so in my opinion, to have this world accepting phenomena or this worldwide concept, you need a user base to accept it. And by definition, if there is a user base to accept it, you do get a network effect that builds upon the user base that exists in the past. So the question then comes down to is how do you get the first user or the first acceptance into the scheme? And that's more of a philosophical question will it be conducted through some sort of a decentral distributed technology, which is interesting because you and I can have different nodes. We can have equal computational power, or we can have some sort of equal regulation into this node. So the decision making is distributed. And then finally, we can have some sort of a majority system where if enough users like us accept on some sort of decision right, and we can increase the threshold for certain other reasons. So you need say, more than 51% of the nodes to agree upon a decision, then you can have a decision made. And so the question then is, does this actually work? And how does the network effect not play into this? Because you and I are understanding of this decision-making process. But then if you have a third person join in, then what happens to the decision-making process? And that's what the distributed ledger sort of helps with, is you can keep adding nodes without reducing the effect of each of the nodes, because you have shared distribution rights, and then you have shared computational powers. But it sort of fails upon one main idea, is how do you have nodes attached, or how do you bring people into this like distributed system? You need to create some understanding and some belief in the system before people buy into the idea. And that's sort of the harder concept there. So the network effect is helpful to bring in initial user base. And then after you have an initial user base, the expansion is much, much quicker. Does that answer your question?
It does. You've mentioned centralized ledgers, decentralized ledgers, distributed ledgers. You're forgetting I'm a 5-year-old.
Sure.
These concepts are going all over my head.
Yeah.
So we will dive into them. But just before that, let's keep economics aside for a moment.
Sure.
Ralph Waldo Emerson had once said that money often costs too much. Can you comment on the psychological impact of money? Does money influence the way people think and feel? And as a follow-up to that, what do you think is the link between money and power? Do you think they work hand in hand?
I'm sure we can spend hours just discussing this one question.
It's a 24-hour podcast. Let's go.
But let's start with the first idea of a hedonic treadmill. So this idea came around, call it about 30 to 40 years ago with Campbell. And the idea is, on this hedonic treadmill, humans regulate emotions and go from a positive emotion or a negative emotion very quickly to a flatline base. What that does is, if you experience a very big expression of positive emotion, over time that positive emotion dwindles down and you have a flatline emotion base. And similarly with sort of a trauma, over time that trauma shovels and you reach away from that trough into some sort of a straight line emotional base. So this hedonic treadmill idea was that over time, even after accruing enough money, you realize that your happiness eventually comes down to a flat line structure. So initially, it was linked to an idea of increased happiness, but over time, that increased happiness has now come to flat surface level. And then this cycle transcends again, where more money is required to come back to that high of happiness that you had attained in the past. And this cycle of increased money that links to an increase in happiness that then fizzles out over time and then asks for more money continues. And that's sort of the idea of the hedonic treadmill, is that you keep walking on this cyclic process of money, and it comes back to, yes, in the end, money does cost too much. It costs you an entirety of psychological impact. To understand the sort of your second idea of psychological impact and money, let's take a thought experiment into play. Let's give a child, or let's give two children a set of money and ask them to spend it on what they prefer and what they like the most. So we'll find two children, we'll give them, call it $5, and ask them to run and buy whatever they can find and buy. Oftentimes you notice that the goods that purchased by children are somewhat similar, in a sense that it's generally some sort of consumable that will over time increase their happiness after they've consumed it. And over time they realize that, oh, this was a great exercise, and they were really happy with it, and they will not generally come back and ask for more because they had that sort of increase in happiness and they were happy with it, and they're continuing to be happy. With adults, it's sort of flipped around. This research showed once that if you give two adults a similar amount of money, generally speaking, the goods and services that they go ahead and buy with this money are very varied. And they really depend on the interests and the alignments of the humans in conversation. So sometimes you might find that this money was spent on consumables. Sometimes you might find that it was held safely for future use. And on other occasions, you might just find that people lost the idea of the money and probably just lost the money itself. So they put it in their pocket, realized that, oh, I reached this shop, I now don't have the same jacket that I was wearing, and this money was held there, and then over time, they just find the money much later. This is all to come back and show that the idea of happiness is a lot similar when you are a child, but the idea of happiness grows varied, and the notion of happiness obtained can change very quickly in adults. So this hand-in-hand notion of money and happiness really starts intensifying in adults, because adults start conflating money with an equation of what they can purchase or what they can value. And this psychological interpretation of money and happiness then increases as you age. And that's the idea of this hedonic treadmill that we discussed about as well. On the flip side, you had Daniel Kahneman, who was a Nobel laureate in 2002, who wrote a paper in 2010. And the paper was about this equation, and he had about a 1.3 million data points, so a rather large subset of data, where he talked about the increase in money and the increase in happiness in individuals up to a certain threshold, after which the diminishing value of money came into play. And so the increase in happiness was not as much as it was for the initial threshold. I think he changed the threshold depending on which nation was observed, but in the US, it was somewhere in the tens of thousands of dollars, in the upper tens of thousands of dollars. And over time, he realized that after that sort of threshold, people didn't value happiness as much. If they were given the same incremental dollar, the increase in happiness was not as much as when they were given the first dollar. And so on one side, you have this idea of, oh, there is this finite theory that regardless of when I give you money, there's an increase in happiness. And then over time, that happiness sort of fizzles out. On the other side, you have Daniel Kahneman's theory, which has that over a certain threshold, incremental money doesn't really influence your happiness anymore. And so there's always a big question of what influence does money have on happiness.
Yeah, Daniel Kahneman has revolutionized the way I think about money. It's not a linear relationship. It's a point of diminishing returns after a while. But there is also power that we need to talk about. So personally, do you feel more powerful when you're earning money?
So this is a good question, and we can inspect it in a few different ways. And I think the initial question is, what do you think about powerful? What does powerful really mean? Is it it's sort of self-subjective, where do you feel powerful from the inside on what you can do or cannot do? Or is it powerful in an external sense, where you realize that you can have influence over externalities and external objects and people? And I'll touch the internal aspect first, and then we'll talk about the external side. The internal side, I think I follow and believe that over a certain threshold, the power sort of diminishes as well, sort of in line with Daniel Kahneman's theory, that initially, yes, it brings you from a point of having to fall on people for daily requirements or daily nourishments or daily artifacts of purchase or daily requirements. The initial sort of earnings help supplement those practices and needs and necessities that you want. And then over time, the greed aspect comes into play, where the increase then only is supported by the increase of money that you can processly aim for. So over time, you realize that you're moving away from necessities into what you would call a broader base of needs. And the broader base of needs are generally not necessary. They fall into this artifact of luxury, and power then becomes luxury, essentially. Let's move to the external part a little bit, and we'll talk about the external bit for a little as well. The external bit is interesting, and most people will think about the external power over other people as a concept that has been induced when seeing people around them. And this is generally through systems that you can observe, and it's systems that you have in place. You and I sitting here is an illustration of how much time we can take out of our lives to have this conversation. And in some sense, that is a powerful idea that we have this time allocation. If you extend the idea from time allocation to money, it's a similar concept where money can be attributed to an increase in ownership and an ownership over external elements. So you can say that, oh, with money, I can use public transport now and I can move from one area to another area. And so I command power over movability, or I command power over some idea that I can go from one place to another. And so I command power over transportation. I command power over two different, almost different landscapes at one moment in time. You can also extend this idea a little bit further from going from just transportation into any sort of facet of life. And that's sort of this external idea of money and power, where if you have a dividing line, you can see that this dividing line is pushed on both sides of the discussion table about how much power can be accrued and how money plays into that accrual process.
Can I ask you another personal question?
Sure.
What role does money play in your life personally? Do you think it adds more purpose to your life? And do you think it serves as an anchor point from which you're able to derive meaning in your life and your work?
I've over time realized that I'm more interested in academia and study. So I think over time, after a certain threshold, I've realized that once I have the necessities covered, the happiness or the power aspect fades very quickly for me. So if I were to plot sort of this chart of money and happiness, very quickly that graph just hits the 0 point. And after that, the stimulation comes from a lot of other external aspects of life, which includes a lot of academia for me. So personally speaking, it plays only a role until a certain threshold, and after that, it doesn't really matter to me anymore.
So it doesn't help in providing any kind of meaning, purpose beyond a certain point. There's a critical point.
I think the critical point is where it starts losing purpose.
And it's up to us to identify that point in our lives. Basically.
Indeed. I'll leave it for the subjective view to identify it and to hopefully stick with that identification and not to change the threshold every so often. If you have a threshold in mind, hopefully you stick with that threshold in mind, and over time you don't increase it or decrease it very willingly unless you have a reason to.
This is a good assignment. This is the first episode of giving homework to the viewers, but yeah, find that critical point, that threshold in your life, and then stick to it. Okay, so let's get back into economics now. Apologize for the digression. You were talking about centralization, so it's time to dive headfirst into it. So William McChesney Martin, longest serving chairman of the Federal Reserve, he had once said that the role of the central bank is to remove the punch bowl just when the party is getting started. So let's introduce the idea of centralization. What is centralization? What is a central bank? What role does it play in the world today?
Let's start with a quick one-line summary of what a central bank is, and then we'll delve a little bit deeper into how we can define it a little bit. So the idea of a central bank is to care for the interests of private banks, care for public welfare, and popular opinion. So it's sort of a network that brings together the interests of private individuals and private ownerships and private banks, the general public, so the societal welfare, and just the opinion, the popular opinion in the economy and research and academic interests about how and why shall an economy serve the wider purpose of the open overall expressions.
Can these interests overlap?
These interests can definitely overlap and have overlapped in the past. And we can think about that as well and how this happened. So let's take the US as an example and how sort of this federal bank or the central bank came into play. So it happened in, I think it was 1793, that private banks were serving people and serving loan interests. So you, as an agrarian, would go to a private bank and ask for some money to buy some fertilizers, and come back with the idea that, oh, after a year, after my crops have grown, after I've collected some money, I can pay back this loan. And so this was this initial idea of like a state and a local bank. Hamilton in like 1793 decided that the local banks had very competitive rates for the local people, but then started into more of their own interests when it came to external people. So if a person from a different state came to and moved to a different state and then went to a bank, they realized that the banks were more positive and more corrective of people originally from their state, and just a little harsher for people who moved from different states. As the US back then, notably was not very well unified, and states had their opinions on other states, and so this started to show in aspects of life, including the banking sector as well. So in 1793, something happened, and the first Bank of the United States was created. So it was a charter for 20 years, and it was going to be renewed had the first Bank of the United States continued in serving its purpose. And we'll come back to this purpose in a little bit. What happened in 20 years later, after the charter ended, was the federal government decided that it did not serve its purpose. It still had this discrimination that we were describing. It moved between its own interests to public interests and had a big demarcation. So friends and family got beneficial rights, beneficial numbers. The non-friends and families had a difficult time even going up to a bank or even getting an appointment to see someone and describe their situation. So and that was 20 years after 1790, I believe it was 1791. So it went up to 1811. A few years later, they realized that we did need an institution that helped create an economy that was more equitable. And so the second Bank of the United States was created 5-ish years later. So in about 1816, again, similar, had a 20 years charter, lasted up to 1836. And Andrew Jackson was a foe of banking regulations in 1836. He wanted institutions to not be centralized. He wanted like states to rule over their own population, and the banks not to be influenced by sort of central policy. And so with every government change, there would be no overall change in sort of the central bank policy. And so he then decided not to have the charter continued or renewed, essentially. So the second Bank of the United States, after 20 years, which was around 1836, was let loose as well and was let to fall. Over time, then for the next 25 years was this regime of free open state banks where every state had their own banks. Every bank provided two major functions. One was for the provision of savings for individuals. So individuals would go put their money in a state bank, hope that the state bank, when they came back, provided the money back to them. And the other was for loans, is that, in times of desperate need and for future needs, when they go to the bank, they can acquire some funds and hopefully pay it back. So these 25 years was this interesting time when state banks regulated their control. They decided who to grant money, who not to grant money to. And I think it was in the 1860s where the first national act, the National Bank Act, was passed. I think it was called the Central Bank Act of 1860s, where the first charter, the first official charter of having a central bank was given, and the first central bank was created. However, the central bank was not widely accepted and also had its own issues on acceptance. So it ties back to our idea that we had initially: what happens if people don't believe in it? Because as politicians on both sides had ideas and opinions, their voter base, depending on which side of the spectrum you fell on, either accepted or rejected it. It was only much later, I believe in 1913, that Woodrow Wilson finally got a larger majority approval and the Federal Reserve Act was passed. And that created the Federal Reserve that we know about the United States. And this was almost a pivotal moment in time, because the Federal Reserve was then decoupled from the government for the first time, where the mandate of the Federal Reserve is decided by the government, but then the Federal Reserve has no reporting to the US government. They enacted starting in 1913 on an individual mandate, and they had no intersection, no overlap with government control. So they had an independent base and an independent body. And so this helped them to create an idea of public understanding and public approval, because they were separated from the government and they cared solely about public interest and private banking interest. So it was this body that moved away from government control into working for the people and generally by the people. And that sort of is a summary of what happened in the United States. But similarly, in countries around the world, people noted that a central institution that monitored two different things. One was, and we'll come and explain this in a little bit, is the amount of money that is in the economy, and B, how the economy understands and plays with the world around it. So the two most important things, and these were sort of mandated in something called a central bank in most economies in the world. And that's sort of the idea of a bank that serves people and serves interests outside the country.
We are going to touch upon decentralization as well at some point, hopefully. So just to set the context, what are some advantages and disadvantages of centralization? And then when we touch upon decentralization, we'll go through the same analysis. So let's talk about central banks first. What are the pros and what are the cons?
Sure. Let's start with the pros, as I like to always sandwich pros, cons, and then go by a little of another pro or two maybe at the end. So we'll go with this pro sandwich.
Okay.
The pros are, since it's disaligned from political interest, most central banks can be independent and produce monetary policy that effectively governs the economy, but is dedicated for the welfare of the people, which may or may not be the case if the interests are aligned or disaligned in a scenario of political interest. So the mandate for central banks in most economies is to create a working condition for banks to operate and for individuals to be able to approach these banks and use their deposits or allow for the issuances of loans. And so the pro of that is there's a centralized unit, a centralized control, a centralized authority that monitors the total amount of money in an economy. And let's talk about what a total amount of money in the economy really does. So if you and I, and we talked about this a little bit with the bushels of wheat example, is if you and I could just increase money in the economy somehow, then we would always have this mistrust of if money is real or not. If you and I could somehow just happen to magically create money, then we wouldn't really know how much money there is in the economy. And if this idea of prices or this unit of value that we talked about and discussed really is worth it, because if the unit of value was $1 before, now we've just increased the total amount of money in the economy by several fold. Maybe this $1 is no longer $1. Maybe it's that several fold that we just increased there. If it's 5x, then it's now a $5 idea. And so the central bank helps eliminate this idea of the increase in monetary supply because they regulate how much money is printed and distributed in the economy. It also serves the purpose of managing financial risk. And this was seen several occasions in several countries. Most notably, the biggest one occurred a few years ago, about maybe 15 years ago, in the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, where almost every economy in the world had some issue with how their banking sector regulated loans and issuances of loans. And so what happens is the central bank dictates how much money private banks need to keep under them so that when you and I go and ask for our savings back, the banks just don't run out of money. And this is something called the reserve ratio. The reserve ratio simply means that if I store $10 at a bank, the bank has to keep some percentage of it with them. So over time, when I go back and ask them for some amount of my money, they have that money physically with them to give. There's also another concept of reserve requirements. And the reserve requirements is simply to make sure that private banks are not running very loose on their loan part of it. So we discussed the accounts part of things, now we're going to discuss the loans part. So the reserve requirements are, over time, banks are not allowed to go and distribute more loans than they should based on some ratio of the assets they hold. And their assets are simply how much monetary supply they have or how much circulation of coin they have, or what their physical assets are. So it's some proportion of that asset base, and that's how much loan they can issue at as well. So these are sort of the two most important concepts regulated by the central bank. And lastly, the last pro that I want to discuss is, since they are independent and since people believe in them, and we talked about this network effect, they can regulate the ups and downs of an economy. So when the economy is running really high or the economy is doing really well, they can increase the cost of money. So they can sort of raise interest rates and increase how much money costs for you to invest money, and then thereby reducing the overall heat up of the economy. And vice versa, when the economy is not doing too well, they can sort of say, oh, okay, we're going to give out money to people or distribute checks to people or increase the overall distribution of money so that everyone has money in the present. They can spend the money, the economy sort of survives and recovers. And then as soon as the economy recovers, they pull back the money and then take back whatever extra money that distributed over time. So these are sort of the ideas of centralization and how centralization helps. What are the cons? Well, the cons are similar to the cons of a centralized economy or a centralized version of some sort of system. And one of them is, well, there are a few people in power that decide these regulations or that decide these open market committee meetings. And most people have to trust these people. Most individuals or people in the economy or you and I have to trust these individuals and hope that these individuals are doing the best in the welfare, best that helps the economy and improves the welfare of the people. And so it's a lot of power with a few individuals, and we hope that they are doing the right job, but we don't really know. And in hindsight, you know yes or no, but at the point in time, it's harder to understand if they are doing it well or not. The other con you can take is sometimes you're influenced by the past and you use precedents from the past to evaluate current conditions as well. So the newer sort of ideas are not enacted upon as quickly as possible because renditions of the past have helped times and periods of depressions in the past. And then hopefully people assume, or bankers assume, that they can use those same sort of ideas and same manuscripts to resolve issues in the current modern time period as well. The issue with that is the modern time periods are very different from what happened 70 years ago. Distribution of money was not as easy, or the regulation or understanding of monetary policy was not as conveniently available. Education wasn't as freely available, and so this idea of conventional wisdom comes into play. And this conventional wisdom idea is one of the cons, in my opinion. To wrap it up, I want to come back to another pro, and one of the ideas of the central bank is the central bank also understands and helps with economies around them. So, for instance, what happened very recently during the pandemic, or when the early onset of the pandemic, is the Federal Bank of the US decided to create and increase the dollar lines to other economies. So when other economies needed US dollars to purchase maybe commodities or to purchase oil for their economy, they opened up these central lines for emerging banks to just have a direct dollar line or dollar credit line from the federal government. So the pro with the Federal Bank of the US was that since it is a centralized source of power, decisions can be made much quicker. And this decision was made in about 1.5 months, and the enactment of the decision occurred in May of 2020, which is much harder and is a much lengthier process if the decision making is more distributed.
It's an interesting pro sandwich that you've created right here. And you did bring us some interesting ideas. I think we've been flirting with this one term for a long time when you're talking about printing money, the cost of money. And we've been flirting with the idea of inflation. So let's introduce inflation now. I'm a 5-year-old. Richin, what is inflation?
Sure. Let's dive into first a little formal definition of money, and then we can talk about inflation. So there's something called a monetary base. And the monetary base of a country is generally how much money is in the circulation of the economy. So that's generally inclusive of all the bills and coins that are in circulation, that you and I hold in our wallets. That includes all the coins and bills that are in the vaults of central banks or just private banks. And it also includes the lines of credit that private banks have with the central bank, because they at times need money or they have too much money so they can give it away to the central bank. So this is something called the monetary base. And after the monetary base, you have other formal definitions of money, which is M0, M1, M2, and M3. M0, not to get too invested in definitions, M0 is simply the total amount of money in an economy. M1 includes your checking accounts as well, including M0. M2 is M1 plus savings accounts and time deposits. And M3 is a combination of all of that, institutional money markets, and some repo agreements. We don't really need to touch upon the latter few, but it's a good notion to understand what monetary base is, the initial monetary base that we were describing. So what happens is, over time, if the cost of money, and what is the cost of money? That simply, if I can go to the bank and get a loan for quite cheap, and then if I can go invest that money somewhere or create a shop or open up a restaurant or do something with it, and if I can somehow make more money in this sort of management process, I can go back to the bank and repay my loans and repay my interest. But then if we do it at a much larger scale, and if everyone in the economy does this, over time you realize that there's just more money in the economy because I could borrow at a cheaper rate. I made more money, so I paid off my loans, and now I have this extra surplus of money. If I just did it infinitely in sort of this recursive pattern, I would just have an infinite amount of money. With an infinite amount of money, I could just purchase infinite number of goods. And so let's dial it back a little bit. Every time this happens, the purchasing power that people have increases quite rapidly. So you and I can just go and buy more goods, more services. And with that comes this supply process or the supply problem. The demand is sort of increasing. You and I have now this extra amount of money. We can either keep it under a bed or we can go buy some more goods and services. And every time that happens, goods and services are generally classified into some categories. But if they are finite or if they are rivalrous, you can get a potato, I can get a potato, but there are only a finite number of potatoes in the market. And if I'm driving to this market and buying potatoes, and if I buy up all the potatoes in that market, no one else has potatoes anymore. So what happens then? The shopkeeper next time is just going to charge me more for these potatoes because he doesn't want me buying up all of the potatoes. And he thinks he can make some profit by selling it for a few extra dollars. So now I don't buy all of the potatoes, but I buy most of them nonetheless. Now another person goes and buys the additional potatoes that are there, but the shopkeeper said, oh no, I sold my potatoes for higher this time, so you have to buy it for that higher price as well. And over time, this increased the prices of all the goods and services in the economy. And that's this idea of inflation, where inflation is simply the price of goods and services in the economy relative to the past. So if I just had the same basket of goods that I was buying, how much could I buy it in December? And now how much can I buy it in January? And that's this idea of inflation. There are a variety of different ways of constructing how inflation can be computed. And the most interesting one that I like is this McDonald's factor. And the McDonald's factor is, what was the price of a quarter pounder last year? What is the price of a quarter pounder this year? The difference between that is simply the inflation.
This is the easiest formula I found for inflation so far. Or actually, I had one. This was I think it was a WhatsApp joke that dads forward to you, where inflation is when you pay $15 for the $10 haircut that you used to get for $5 when you had hair.
Sure.
So everything you've described about inflation sounds evil, sounds bad. If I'm a consumer, I don't want to pay more for potatoes or a haircut or a quarter pounder. Even during the Second World War, FDR had launched his entire campaign where he was marshalling Americans to fight inflation, and it was portrayed as his big enemy. And that was his excuse for putting a lot of price ceilings, for controlling wages as well. But what we find now is a lot of governments actually targeting inflation and there's building a framework of inflation targeting as their monetary policy. So, Richin, can you clear the air? Is inflation good or bad?
Like every coin has two sides. Inflation has the other side as well, which is the good of inflation. And what's the good? Well, over time, you do want what you own to increase in value. So if you and I have anything in our house, you do want the appreciation of that value, because these goods and services over time generally lose value because they depreciate. So if I have a table, over time the table becomes rusty and dusted and has cracks and develops scratches, and it loses value over time. But over time, I still want the value to be the same, at least like a standard line, so like a straight line. If anything, I wanted to, sure, it loses its legs and it loses its structural rigidity and maybe becomes a little bit wobbly, but I still want the table to be worth how much it was in the past. And that's sort of this positive side on inflation. Is inflation can be measured in two different ways. One is the prices of goods and services, like we described, but one's also the healthiness of the economy. So if prices are going up, someone on the other end is receiving more for the potatoes they just sold. And then they can go buy other goods and services that they want. So it's also this healthiness of the economy where, yes, one consumer is paying more, but the producer is receiving more on the other end as well. And so thereby increasing the effectiveness of the consumers, the producer, who then in turn becomes a consumer, and this cycle continues onwards. So I bought the potato seller now is going to buy some onions, then the onion seller will go and buy tomatoes, and the tomato seller will then go buy a haircut. And so over time, this increases the total amount of wages that people earn in the economy. And this helps create this notion of the GDP. So what is the GDP? The GDP of an economy, or the gross domestic product of the economy, is simply if you add up all the goods and services produced in an economy, how much does that total up to? And if the prices are constant, then the healthiness of the economy remains constant over time. But however, if the prices go up, then you can say that, oh, my economy has sort of grown because yes, it costed someone, but someone benefited out of that. And that benefit then helped and transformed the life of that person. And then that person went, and so there's this multiplier effect. And this multiplier effect is the good of inflation.
A very diplomatic answer. Yeah. -5 points for that. Okay. On the show, Planet Money,
Sure.
a 10-year-old called in one day and she said, why can't the government just print its own money and then use that for government spending? Why does the government need to tax people and then run the risk of budget deficits? Why can't the government just print its own money, make unemployment go away? And anytime inflation rises, just increase the taxes, make it go away. Sounds like a simple question, very flippant, but she did touch upon this idea that's gaining a lot of momentum, which is called modern monetary theory. And we saw a microcosm of MMT during the pandemic when the government actually printed money to issue these stimulus checks. So, Richin, what is modern monetary theory? Do you think it is a sustainable theory, an idea that we can implement moving forward?
Sure. Let's give a brief definition of modern monetary theory. The simplest definition would be it's something, or it's a no-limit spending capacity of a government given two conditions. One of the conditions is the government is the sovereign owner and issuer of that money. And B is that money is not tied to another currency. What that means is for instance, if we take the US, it cannot start distributing euros for that matter, because it's not the sovereign issuer and holder of the euros. And the other part is that the US dollar is not pegged to any other currency, and hence it can follow this modern monetary theory. If in fact you were pegged to a different currency, this wouldn't apply. Because, for instance, if we take Hong Kong, the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar, and we can talk about pegs and free-floating interest rates in a little bit, free-floating currency rates in a little bit as well. But the Hong Kong printing Hong Kong dollars in an infinite capacity then undermines the value of the US dollar. And this is exactly what we discussed earlier, what happened with the Bretton Woods system, is if the Hong Kong government prints enough money, then people can go and ask for US dollars in return. The US dollars then sort of depreciates in value. And then overall you realize that, oh, there's infinite number of US dollars and I can just buy as many potatoes as I want, as I need. So modern monetary theory is this idea that governments have a no limit on its spending capacity during times of need, and they can dial it back when the times of needs are over. So addressing your second half of the question, which is about my thoughts on modern monetary theory, the idea that the government is now following the mandate of most central banks in the world is interesting in some sense, and it's complementary to the mandate of central banks in the world, which generally have monetary policy to regulate to help the citizens of the economy, can be A, complementary, or B, sort of almost interjectory. And what I mean by that is it can complement the federal bank by substituting or creating additional welfare for the economy, or stimulating the economy by creating these stimulus checks. Or it can be complementary in a sense that the federal bank can work on monetary policy versus the government can work on fiscal policies. The interjection might happen if the government decides to go above or beyond, or go conversing or opposite to the direction of what the Fed or the central bank of that economy try to do. And that can be an issue as well. And those issues are generally harder to address because each of those entities are not regulated by the other. So there is no central authority. And then decision making can be slightly more interfering in that sense. So for instance, the federal bank could have a easing of interest rates to help stir the economy, but the government could be doing something completely different, as increasing taxes on certain parts of the economy that are doing well. However, the mandate or the necessity for not having such increased taxes in the for the foreseeable future might be a strong argument. And so modern monetary theory in some sense can be complementary, but in other times can be somewhat taking away from the purpose of the central bank.
So the 10-year-old in Planet Money, who thought I was asking a simple question, actually touched upon a very complex idea.
Indeed, indeed. The 10-year-olds have the more interesting questions sometimes.
To all the 10-year-olds watching, and we know you are, keep doing it. Keep asking those questions. Okay, so we've touched upon centralization. I think it's only fair, and we care about fairness on the show, so that we touch about decentralization. So to introduce the topic, I think it'll be a great idea to talk about the thought experiment that's known as the Byzantine Generals Problem. So what is the Byzantine Generals Problem? How does it link with decentralization?
Absolutely. So imagine a scenario when you have a few groups of people, and each group of people wants to do something different. So say, for instance, you have 5, and this was the initial idea of the Byzantine General Problem, is say you have 5 warriors, and there are 2 groups, or there are 2 ideas that you can either go and attack or raid sort of this building, or you can retreat and wait for another time. And the options there you have binary solutions to them. So if you retreat, you must all retreat together, else the people attacking will lose their lives or probably be defeated. Or if you attack, then you should attack in solidarity so that there is this, like we talked about earlier, this network effect of everyone collaborating to the effort. And so the effect is multiplied a little bit. However, there can be times where if you have a centralized authority, you might have this issue that someone is demotivated by that centralized authority and chooses to do something different. Excuse me. And in this case, if one person defects from the overall objective, then it becomes harder for the 5 people or the 4 people left behind to go ahead and proceed with the attack or go ahead or retreat. And this can also be understood in a different sense, and we'll come to decentralization now, is say if you had 2 groups of people, so 2 different nodes, who were sort of the central authority, so they commanded their own respective groups. So you can think of them as sub-generals almost. And then you had the 5th person who was in an equivalent rank, and to please both the sub-generals, because he or she or they wanted to become the new sub-general, they agreed upon what the sub-generals wanted. So one sub-general wanted to attack, one sub-general wanted to retreat. So two people wanted to attack, two wanted to retreat, and the fifth person who wanted to please the subgenerals decided to send what the subgenerals were doing to both the subgenerals. So he or she or they said to the first one, okay, we will attack, and said to the second that when we will retreat. And when that happens, the first subgeneral thought that three people wanted to attack, and thus the majority was convinced, and so the attack will carry forward. The second subgeneral thought that three people said that they'll retreat, and thus they assumed that the majority convinced everyone to retreat, and thus each of the subgenerals thought that they have the entire group following them. However, what happened is each of the subgenerals lost their sort of army, or the one person following them. And this is sort of the Byzantine Generals Problem, is that if you have a faulty node or a faulty idea, it can create an illusion of multiple answers. And in this case, this illusion was both attack and retreat at the same time. So you can almost think of it as the idea that scientist Schrödinger had of this illusion of yes and no, or the presence or the unpresence of a cat in a box almost. And moving on from centralization to distributed responsibility is distributed responsibility can help solve this problem using a variety of different ways. And we'll touch upon the most basic ways. One is the idea of signatures. So in the internet, there is this idea of digital signatures or cryptographic digital signatures. And if you can somehow prove to me that you gave me the message that you gave to the other person as well, then I can be certain that the person who was pleasing or trying to please both the subgenerals did not have multiple answers, only had one answer. And this only holds if 2/3 of all present nodes are not corrupted. So what that means is if more than 2/3 of all nodes are correct, the distributed system will hold. And we can run through why this is the case. So let's assume that this is not the case, and we have one failed node and we have two correct nodes. So in this case, the correct nodes is less than 2/3. And what happens then is, say A is the faulty node, A tells B to attack, A tells C to retreat, but then B can go to C and say that A told me to attack. But C has no way to verify that B is correct or not, because it only has one hearsay from B. But imagine if you have A, B, C, and D, then C is receiving a message from B and D about A, and thus can confirm if the message makes sense or not. And so anytime the distributed system has more than 2/3 of the nodes correct, you are less likely to run into the Byzantine Generals Problem. And that is called the Byzantine Fault. And so that can be avoided. So there are other more complex theories on how you can solve the Byzantine Fault issue. And we've come to a stage where even less than 2/3 of correct nodes will still result in a Byzantine network being correct and away from Byzantine Fault. And that's to do more with something called hashing. We can investigate the issue a little bit more in detail, but I don't want to spend too much time. But the idea is, in a subgeneral, the subgeneral produces a message. Each of the subgeneral's followers somehow checks that the message is correct or not. And then after the checking, sends a reply saying, we have checked and verified the subgeneral's message and the message is correct. And that's sort of the idea of hashing. It's slightly more complex, and it has to do with public and private keys, and we can delve into that a little bit later. But that's sort of the idea of distributed systems coming from the Byzantine Generals Problem.
So if I were to ask you to then create a pro-con-pro sandwich for decentralization as well, what would that look like, and which side do you lean on more?
Yeah, so let's actually first uncover the difference between decentralization and distributed. So decentralization is that decision-making and processing does not rest with a central authority. However, distributed can be centralized and distributed, or distributed can be decentralized and distributed. So both centralization and decentralization have an attribute of distributed technology or distributed manifestation. So coming to decentralization is simply an idea that multiple people or multiple nodes or multiple identities have the equal decision-making power and the equal computational power. So we'll do a pro-con-pro sandwich again, like I always like it. And so the idea there is, the pro for decentralization is this idea of failure. So the pro is that in a centralized system, if the central node breaks or the central node is faulty, the entire system breaks down. So you can imagine in scenarios where you can take examples of real life, or we can take examples of the smart sort of Internet of Things. In real life, it can happen if, when we talked about central authorities, if a central authority somehow has incorrect data and makes a decision that might not be the best for the economy, or is the best in a limited frame or for a limited set of people, but not for the overall benefit of the economy. And a decentralized system then helps to have more people attesting to that decision. And then you can have some sort of factor to decide if the decision should go forward or not. Most simply, the majority holds principle that, if 51% of the decentralized nodes make the same decision, then yes, we will go ahead with that decision. And if not, then we don't go ahead with that decision. And there are other more complex mechanisms that you can decide if a decision has to be made or has to be upheld. And that's sort of one pro. The other pro is understanding this idea of what happens when maintenance has to occur. So at times you need to maintain your network, or you need to maintain your economy, or you need to have some sort of downtime. In a centralized space, if the downtime occurs, then the entire system is down for a little while. And this is most notably known in websites, when you've probably seen that 404 error on like websites, and the website just like goes down, and you're trying to buy this ticket, and a ton of people are trying to buy the same ticket as you, and the website just crashes because the gateway can't hold all these ping requests. In a decentralized system, now that you have multiple nodes doing computations, so you're pinging a server maybe in New York, but then someone else buying a ticket in Dubai is pinging a server in Dubai, and hence the workload is sort of distributed between different servers, and that holds the entirety of the system a little bit longer. Going to the cons, well, what happens about maintenance? Now, I told you about the centralization of maintenance, but in a decentralized maintenance, if you're maintaining the entire network, or you have to upgrade the entire network, so you need to move to a different operating system, or you need to move to a different academic instruction, it takes longer than a centralized service. Because a centralized service, you only need to change one node or one artifact, versus here you need to go to every node and change it. So this can be best illustrated in an example of, say, streetlights. So if one streetlight goes down, it's fine. It doesn't matter, because the other streetlights will provide enough light for cars to drive at night. However, if you're trying to upgrade from maybe older lamps to LED lamps, or along the lines of that, then the entire system takes longer, because every node or every street line needs to be changed. And so the maintenance process is much longer. So upgrades generally cost more time, more energy, and more computation power. Back to like the last layer of the sandwich.
Another pro.
The last pro. The pro of decentralization is, well, we talked about distributed responsibility, and the distributed responsibility helps in making critical decisions not hastily, but through a larger consensus. So it helps with what you would call a democratization of process. You can have more people or more nodes attesting to this decision and hoping that the decision helps the welfare of more number of people or more of the economy than a centralized source would.
Sorry, can we stop there? Do you think
Sure.
democracy is an ideal that we should strive for in markets and economy?
I think hearing voices is not a bad idea. Using the ideas of voices and then coming to a refinement of the ideas is another level from there. However, the one thing to note there is the number of voices you hear helps you refine your decision making, in that it helps you understand what the larger consensus of people is. However, that takes a little longer. To get a response from everyone in the economy, or to get a response or a survey conducted for every human being in a nation state, just generally takes a longer. So sometimes, in case of emergencies, if you need to make a decision, maybe a distributed right of responsibility, that I sign off my responsibility or my duty or my vote to someone, reduces the number of nodes that need to be consulted when an emergency has to be made.
All very interesting topics, explained with a lot of clarity.
Sure.
And as a 5-year-old who entered this interview with no prior understanding of any of these concepts, I'm sure I'm coming out much richer.
Sure.
It's time to start wrapping up, Richin. So before we move on to our final questions, I'd love for you to interpret what you've built with the Lego there. What do you think I've built?
Fascinating. I was too enthralled by just using this Lego as an artifact of play than building anything. But I have a slide in front of me.
A slide?
A slide. I'm sliding from one point to another.
Look at that, the metaphor.
The metaphor of, exactly. When we talked about the manifestation of moving from one point to another, I thought subconsciously I was trying to imitate that, but maybe I did that.
Well, I see the DIFC Gate Avenue talking all about finance, and look at that.
I know,
the
exactly.
monument
The
in
monument
living
in
color.
DIFC.
What do you think this is? Definitely not a slide.
That looks to me like the bushels of wheat being produced on an agrarian farm. There's the wheat, there's the farm, and there's a silo to hold the wheat.
I'll sign this and you can frame it in your bedroom. Masterpieces made on this episode, as you can see. Okay, final questions. What are some books, movies, or people that have strongly influenced you in your life?
Wow, if I could list that in an hour, I would be surprised. Sure, I think we'll start with people and sort of times and ideas. Averroes has always influenced me with his philosophy. The Carolingian Renaissance was sort of the periods of Renaissance that I admire the most, that occurred in the 980s, so one of the first medieval Renaissances. I've looked upon a lot at contemporaries like Thomas Philippon, Sunil Gulati, and a few others who are very respectable in their fields of academia, and similar to what we've been discussing about economic policy and monetary policy. I've always looked upon Descartes on his Meditations on First Philosophy as something to be influenced by, because of the idea of the understanding yourself and yourself being this concept of I exist, and so I have this understanding and I have this belief and I hold this belief. I've always looked upon the initial books, or one of the more initial books I've read in economics, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, as an influence in how I got here. I've found Machiavelli's Prince and Discourses quite influential in my life, being raised in Dubai and following that sort of idea of Machiavelli's Prince. Indra Nooyi has been an inspiration for me as well. Her book, My Life in Full, is a well represented idea of how she grew up as one of the only females in sort of her industry, and worked as what you would call like an outsider while being an insider nonetheless. Some movies, that's a tough one. I think, to name a few, Three Identical Strangers, Capernaum, A Sun, Burning, Talvar, West Beirut, Omar, are just the first that come to my mind, and I can go on with this list and probably create another few hours of viewing for the listeners.
Nobody's complaining. I'm here all night.
But I'll stop there, I think, at this point.
It's an eclectic list that you have there. What would you like your legacy to be like?
That
I
has
don't know what
made
he
me
thought is a
think.
show of easy questions.
Has made me think and pause me. And that one is a deep question you've asked, Shalaj.
Yeah.
My legacy.
I don't regret it one bit.
The legacy I want to be left with is a bridge of understanding between institutions, ideas, and humans. So serving as a connection between the three is sort of what I want to leave my legacy as. And that could be via a variety of different things, but most notably would be most notably in the realm of understanding monetary policy and enacting monetary policy for economies at large.
Very poetic. Let me ask you a follow-up. What would like the legacy of the human civilization be like?
The legacy of the human civilization, a much larger concept, Shalaj. I want to flip back the question to you. I think this has been a conversation where I've spoken for about 95% of the time. So I want to hear this.
This is how it works, Richin. I ask the questions, you give the answers. If you want any answers from me, start your own show.
My grandfather always talked about something, and he always mentioned that the moment you disappear from the face of the earth is not when your physical body subsides, but more when the last person to remember you forgets you. And I think the legacy of the human civilization could be summed up in a similar statement. I hope that human civilization can be remembered much after, if ever, they dissipate.
Interesting. Very interesting. Now, time for the final question.
And what that may be.
What may that be? Yeah. The critics out on it. Okay, so we've talked about money, markets, macroeconomics, financial models, barter system. We didn't touch about trading that much. We talked about inflation, centralization, decentralization. We created pro-con sandwiches. So it ultimately begs the question, Richin, what is the meaning of this all? What do you think is the meaning of life?
What is the meaning of life? If I could sum that up in a few lines.
You can speak a paragraph.
I should start my own podcast show at that point.
There's no restriction.
The meaning of life is understanding the realm and understanding the chamber you've been allocated. You will pass through and you see yourself escaping.
Can you elaborate?
Well, you asked me the meaning. You didn't ask me to define or explain it.
One follow-up question. Let's define the meaning.
Sure. I believe the meaning of life, and going back to this analogy of the passage or the cylinder that you've been put into, is sort of the cards that you're dealt with. So it's understanding the cards you've dealt with, you are dealt, working your way around the cards you're dealt with, either accepting them or changing them. And then over time, realizing that maybe you can escape out of it completely. Maybe you can just get a full shuffle and you can receive a new deck completely. And the meaning of life is observing these three different patterns and understanding which patterns you want to observe and follow and which patterns you see yourself fitting and molding yourself into.
Right. Yeah, that's a great meaning to have.
Sure.
Richin, thank you so much. If people want to connect with you online, in person, where can they do so?
Absolutely. I think email and Instagram are probably the most easy methods too. Instagram, Shalaj can give you my Instagram page, and email is simply my first name, last name @gmail.com.